Hi, I'm Swatch. The next PoE2 League is coming at the end of May, and with it, potentially some pretty sweeping balance changes. One of the hottest topics in PoE2 right now is spell levels. Because spell levels scale a spell's base damage, most caster builds chase as many of them as possible, and a lot of caster gear lives or dies by whether it has the right level mods. So I wanted to ask, what happens if you build a caster that doesn't care about spell levels at all? How does that change gearing? How would you scale the damage? And how cheap does gear become when you can ignore one of the most expensive caster affixes in the entire game? There aren't many ways to deal spell damage in PoE2 without scaling from skill levels, but one of them, the one you see here, is Mana Flare. You might know Mana Flare from the Oracle Temporalis Auto Bomber, where it acts as a ZDPS trigger for Choir the Storm's Lightning Bolt, which does all the damage. But I wanted to build around Mana Flare itself and see how far I could push it as a mana stacker. And as you can probably see here, the result turned out to be far better than I expected. It's not as strong as top Spark or Comet Spam setups in raw clear speed or DPS, but it's cheap to get into, it scales very hard with investment, is extremely tanky, it maps smoothly, and it has respectable bossing damage with room to grow, especially once a couple bugs are fixed next patch. In content like Ritual and Simulacrum, where monsters spawn in around you, it starts to feel like a proper auto bomber even without Temporalis, as you can see here in this Twisted Domain. And if you do add to Temporalis, well, the clear becomes pretty nuts, approaching the feel of the Choir Auto Bomber without relying on the self-proc loop that might not survive the next major patch. This video will include path of building links, but not a full written guide just yet. This build occupies a very strange mechanical space, and after Incendigon got nuked from orbit right after I wrote the Icy Gate Veins guide for it, I'm a little bit cautious about doing that again before patch notes. So for now, I just want to show the build, explain why it works, and put this very unusual no spell level caster archetype out there, and see what people think of it. To start, let's take a look at Mana Flare's basics. It's a spell-tagged support gem that can support any skill that hits enemies. When that skill crits, it procs Mana Flare, consuming 25% of your current mana to deal that much fire damage in a 2 meter radius around the target. Mana Flare has a 1 second base cooldown and a base crit chance of 7%, which is pretty typical for a fire spell. Two things immediately stand out. First, 2 meters is very small. Second, a 1 second cooldown means clear can feel pretty sluggish if you're just waiting around for procs. So for mapping, we're going to want a lot of increased area of effect and a lot of cooldown recovery rate. Now let's talk damage. To get the highest base damage possible for Mana Flare, we need to scale our mana as high as possible. And because Mana Flare uses current mana rather than maximum mana, we can exploit mana overflow, pushing the theoretical damage ceiling 50% higher. It's quite feasible to hit around 10k or above max mana by stacking mana in ES, then running Eldritch Battery to convert all ES to flat mana. We can then overflow that to 15k current mana. If Mana Flare then consumes 25% of that, it gives us a base hit of 3750. For context, that's around the same as a level 36 Doom Blast from Impending Doom, which is not bad at all. But it's nowhere near the base damage of something like a fire-infused level 40 Comet, which is around 45k. So if we want the setup to work, we need some very powerful damage scaling. Thankfully, mana stacking gives us exactly that in several very powerful ways. The most obvious is Archmage, a spirit gem that gives spells 4% of damage as extra lightning per 100 max mana. On a 10k mana setup, that's 400% as extra lightning, or effectively a 5 times damage multiplier. It also means most of the hit is lightning, giving us easy access to shock. Mana Flare benefits from the upside because it's a spell tag trigger, but it consumes a fixed percentage of current mana and it isn't a cast, so it doesn't really care about Archmage's added mana cost. The other huge mana stacking scaler is Wrathpith Globe. Wrathpith itself is an old life stacking staple, but this league added cultivation orbs, which can replace some unique modifiers on Val themed gear with cultivated versions. This means that we can take Wrathpith's normal life scaling damage and crit modifiers and make them scale from max mana instead. A mana Wrathpith gives us 6% increased damage and 3% increased crit chance per 100 maximum mana. Combined with Arcane Intensity on the tree, we get 9% increased damage per 100 max mana. On a 10k mana setup, that's 900% increased damage, or a 10 times multiplier before other increased damage. And 300% crit chance makes both triggering Mana Flare and scaling its damage much easier. So to recap, every 100 max mana gives us 37.5 base damage, assuming 50% overflow, 9% increased damage, 3% increased crit chance, and 4% damage gained as extra lightning. That's 4 separate damage axes scaling from the same stat, so the returns from adding more mana get very silly very quickly. Here's a graph of relative mana scaling assuming 500% crit multi, which is around where my current bossing setup sits. If you swap into the build at around 4k mana like I did, which is where the graph is normalised to, then scaling to just 6k max mana is already roughly a 3.15 times damage increase from mana scaling alone. By the time you hit 10k mana, you're dealing almost 15 times the damage you did at 4k. In absolutely god tier gear with 12k mana, you'd be about 28 times as powerful. This made gearing feel a lot like a stronger stacking archetype from PoE1, where every upgrade to your core stat felt immediately very impactful, and really that was one of the most enjoyable parts of putting this build together. Now let's talk about our choice of ascendancy. Mana Flare creates three big problems for the build. We need reliable crits to trigger it and scale its damage, we need enough sustain to keep current mana high, and we need a bossing plan for fights where any mapping sustain options will fall off. Blood Mage solves the crit problem almost single-handedly with Sunder the Flesh, which gives all of our spells 15% base crit chance. Mana Flare normally has 7%, so this more than doubles its base crit, and it also means our delivery spells do not need naturally high crit to work well. If a spell has a good hit pattern, Blood Mage can make it a Mana Flare trigger. Blood Mage also gives us very strong sustain package. Some spell costs are shifted from mana to life, reducing pressure on the mana pool, while Life Remnants gives a huge life sustain and life overflow. Those remnants also become mana sustain through Arcane Remnants, which gives 3% of maximum mana whenever we pick up any remnant. Combined with Mana Remnants, mana on kill, and some regen investment, mapping sustain feels extremely strong. Bossing is where that sustain strategy needs some help. In long single target fights, kills and remnants are much less reliable or outright unavailable, so repeated Mana Flare procs would drain our current mana and tank our damage on a hit-based build. That's where Blood Barbs comes in. It lets all of our elemental damage contribute to bleed magnitude, which is normally restricted to physical damage. Since this build deals entirely elemental damage, that's perfect. It also makes bleeding aggravated on cursed targets, and because we run Blasphemy, bosses are cursed whenever we're in range. So we can apply one big Mana Flare hit at full overflow, turn it into a large aggravated bleed, then spend the bleed duration regenerating mana back into overflow before applying the next one. For the last 4 ascendancy points, there are two main options. The defensive route is Crimson Power, which gives maximum life based on the energy shield on your equip chest. With a good ES chest, especially something like a Series Splendor, this can be well over 1k extra life, which then overflows while mapping and makes the damage taken from mana before life setup much easier to balance, because your life can take more pressure. The alternate offensive route is Gore Spike for crit damage, plus Whispers of the Flesh to reserve 15% of cursed enemies' maximum life, effectively reducing how much damage you need to deal to bosses and tanky rares. If you have a good ES chest, I strongly prefer Crimson Power. On my setup, it helps reach around 5k overflowed life and 15k overflowed mana while mapping, giving the build an absurdly large max hit pool for a non-energy shield character. Before getting into our actual skill setup, there is one fun advantage to building around a support gem. Since patch point 3, you can only use one copy of a given skill gem on a character. Mana Flare gets around that because it's a support gem, letting us run two entirely different Mana Flare setups, one for mapping and one for bossing. For mapping, we want coverage, repeated hits, AoE, and cooldown recovery. The skill zone damage doesn't matter at all, just that it hits frequently over a wide area. For bossing, we want one clean Mana Flare hit that applies a huge bleed while we wait for mana regeneration. And in both cases, we can keep the delivery skills low level because its damage is irrelevant, keeping mana costs low even with an archmage and eldritch battery setup. For mapping, one skill felt absolutely incredible and turns the build into a situational auto-bomber, and that's Entangle. Entangle is a physical AoE spell that creates fissures which crawl forward along the ground, damaging enemies in their path. But more importantly, while these fissures persist, they attach vines to nearby enemies every 0.1 seconds, dealing hit damage and slowing enemies. For most builds, the damage on Entangle itself is not especially exciting, but for us that doesn't matter, because it creates a big, persistent field that will repeatedly hit enemies within it. So instead of casting a spell that directly kills the screen, we cast Entangle once, the fissures crawl forward, and vines repeatedly lash out at enemies, upon which Mana Flare detonates through the pack on its cooldown. With enough AoE and cooldown recovery, this starts to feel like an auto-bomber. You cast once per screen, or sometimes once every couple of screens, and the skill does all the targeting for you. This is especially strong in content where monsters spawn into an area you can prepare ahead of time. Ritual is the obvious example. You can lay down fissures before starting the encounter, and as monsters spawn in, they immediately get hit by vines and start proccing Mana Flare. Essence mobs work similarly. You can preload Entangle under them, release the mob, and it gets hit and killed almost instantly. The mapping links are Mana Flare, obviously, Branching Fissures 2, Magnified Area 2, Cooldown Recovery 2, and Pinpoint Critical. Branching Fissures 2 lets each fissure branch twice, massively increasing Entangle's coverage. The important part here is that its damage penalty only applies to the branched fissures themselves. Unlike something like Spell Cascade, it doesn't apply a global less damage penalty to the triggered Mana Flare, so we get a huge increase to coverage without gutting our damage. Magnified Area 2 and Cooldown Recovery 2 are both there to solve Mana Flare's baseline limitations, 2 meter radius and 1 second cooldown. On my current setup, Mana Flare's cooldown is down to 0.4 seconds, giving 2.5 times the baseline proc frequency with a 3 meter radius or 2.2 times the area coverage. Finally, Pinpoint Critical gives a large boost to crit chance at the cost of crit multi. For mapping, that's completely fine because damage requirements are lower and it lets us spend passive points on Mana Sustain, Cooldown Recovery and AoE instead of more crit chance. If you want to just damage against targets with high elemental resistances, Rakiata's Flow is a solid swap over Cooldown Recovery 2. You can also supplement Cure Clear with Detonate Dead, which is another skill that scales well without excessive spell levels. The Corpse life-based physical explosion is supplemented by Archmage, and with our AoE scaling it can one-shot a huge portion of the screen. I support it with Magnified Area, Mobility, Rapid Casting, Zenith 2 and Efficiency 2 to keep it fast and cheap to cast. For bossing, the setup changes quite a bit. Instead of triggering Mana Flare as often as possible, we want one big hit where our mana is overflown, then downtime to regenerate while the bleed deals damage. That's where Frost Darts really shines. It's a short cast time, fast projectile spell that fires 3 projectiles which all land before Mana Flare comes off cooldown from the first hit. So one cast gives us one high value Mana Flare proc to roll our bleed without draining our mana multiple times. The result is a clean bossing playstyle with no long casts or channels. You fire Frost Darts off quickly, apply the bleed, then you're free to move, kite, dodge mechanics, whatever you like. The bossing links are Concentrated Area, Bleed, Concoct 2, and Overcharge. Concentrated Area is the obvious single target choice. We don't need any coverage here, so we're happy to trade Area of Effect for a huge more damage modifier. Bleed 3 gives the setup 100% chance to inflict bleeding, without which scaling bleed chance is difficult. Concoct 2 is an absurdly strong bleed support, consuming 30% of your life flask's maximum charges to give 3% more bleed magnitude per charge removed. A top rolled life flask has 127 charges, leading to 38 charges consumed per proc, and a huge 114% more bleed magnitude. With good gear, no boss survives more than 3 bleeds. This lets you amplify before your flask runs dry. Ideally, the final support slot here would be Deep Cuts 2, which works out overall at 40% more bleed DPS. The problem is that, at least at the time of making this video, Deep Cuts is bugged with spells. It applies the less hit damage penalty, but not the more bleed magnitude. GGG are aware of this bug, and I expect it to be fixed with 0.5. So for now, I use Overcharge instead. It's only a modest shock magnitude boost, but a shock protection charm negates the reflected shock downside. Deep Cuts 2 over Overcharge would give us about 35% more damage than this setup, but the bossing damage is still pretty respectable. It isn't close to what my old Ignite Infernalist could do with Comet, but the trade-off is that Frost Darts is safe, fast, and doesn't lock us into a hard cast. This is still one part of the build I'm developing, but I'm pretty happy with where the bossing is and how much more room it has to scale. Now that we've covered the active skill setups, let's talk about the Spirit Gems, because this is another place where not needing spell levels really changes the build for the better. Most casters really don't want to mainhand a Scepter, because Scepters give no useful spell levels outside minions, no increased spell damage, and no damage as extra elements. For us, that doesn't really matter. We don't scale spell levels, Archmage already gives us a huge amount of damage as extra lightning, and Mana Wrathpith handles increased damage. So the Scepter is a clean way to solve Spirit while also giving flat mana, mana regen, discipline converted into mana, and potentially aura magnitude as well. For the Scepter implicit aura, discipline is the obvious choice, giving around 300 to our total mana, meaning it's not affected by percent mana modifiers, but it is affected by any aura magnitude the character has. Archmage is mandatory, as covered earlier. After that, we run Mana Remnants, which pairs very well with Blood Mage's baseline Life Remnants. Mana Remnants helps directly, Life Remnants keeps her life overflown, and Arcane Remnants turns every remnant pickup into 3% max mana recovered. As Blood Mage regenerates so many Life Remnants while mapping, Catal's Rejuvenation is also a very reliable way to keep his cooldown recovery buff fully stacked at all times. We also run Blasphemy with Temporal Chains and Enfeeble. This is a strong defensive layer while mapping, and it also keeps bosses cursed for blood barbs, making bleed aggravation automated and reliable. For mobility, we run Blink. The build already stacks a lot of cooldown recovery, so Blink is the natural choice here. My Blink cooldown is around 1.1 seconds in this setup, which makes movement feel much cleaner on a build that otherwise struggles to scale its movement speed. At the time of recording, Atziri's Impatience doesn't apply its life or mana cost penalty to Blink, making it the obvious support here, though I wouldn't be shocked if that changes. Any leftover spirit can go into generic spirit support gems like Clarity 1 or 2, or even both, to help mana sustain. Defensively, we use Mind Over Matter to turn our huge mana pool into a secondary health pool, able to take a large share of damage from our life pool. Crimson Power helps balance this. With a high energy shield chest, especially something like Atziri's Splendor as we said before, we gain a large amount of max life which then overflows while mapping. This means we don't need to push damage taken from Mana Before Life insanely high. Around 70 to 75% is generally enough to optimise your max hit, saving some affix and tree pressure. Path to Building is your friend here, because the ideal number depends on your exact life and mana pools. The build also feels very comfortable against damage over time. Mana builds naturally invest into a lot of mana regen, and with damage taken from Mana Before Life, that regen is doing defensive work as well. Then on top of the huge health pool, Blasphemy gives us temporal chains and enfeeble, so enemies are slower and hit less hard. Blink also helps a lot with repositioning, especially given how much cooldown recovery the build already stacks. Map mods are fairly kind to the build too. There is no mana recovery penalty mod, and less life recovery isn't a brick because of our life remnants giving so much overkill sustain, and even reduced cooldown recovery mostly just makes clear and blink feel a little bit worse rather than disabling the build. For charms, I prioritise freeze and shock protection. Shock protection is especially nice with overcharge. If you take Crimson Power and build a decent life pool, stun also becomes much less scary than it is for most Mind Over Matter builds. You can still die on this setup to boss shotguns or getting heavy stunned while sprinting near dangerous mobs, but while mapping, the huge effective health pool and sustain make this one of the tankiest builds I've ever played, with exceptional defensive quality of life. Gearing is where the build's premise really pays dividends. Mana Stacker gear has a reputation for being expensive, but a lot of that cost comes from needing spell levels and spirit on top of the mana. We don't need either. The Scepter solves spirit and Mana Flare doesn't care about spell levels, and we can skip things like +3 amulets, spirit chest stat fixes, helmet spirit corruptions, and expensive Prism of Belief diamonds. So a lot of gear that looks brick for a normal caster is really quite excellent for us. The amulet is the clearest example. If you remove spell levels and spirit from the equation, you can stack a ridiculous amount of mana, intelligence, ES, and damage taken from Mana Before Life on the slot for a fraction of what a conventional mana stacker amulet would cost. The same applies across the rest of the gear. A high mana roll that most builds treat as filler can be one of our best damage and defense prefixes, so gearing the early versions of the build is much cheaper than you might expect. Let's go through each gear slot. We've talked about the Scepter already. A high level discipline implicit, high spirit, max mana, intelligence, mana regen, and aura magnitude are all very desirable. For Mana Wrathpith, Blood Mage Sustain lets us get away with versions of this which still have the added max life spell cost, which most builds consider bricked and are much cheaper as a result. Ideally, you want the %ES modifier still intact, and then as many augment slots as possible. Idols slotted in the focus give 10% cooldown recovery per slot here, which is great for smoothing out mapping clear. If you're running Temporalis, Mana Runes are strong here instead. For the chest slot, you have several strong options depending on budget. Cloak of Defiance is amazing as a starter piece, giving 65% damage taken from Mana Before Life when slotted with a Willpower rune. This almost single-handedly solves defense and frees up a lot of tree passives. It can also roll up to 450 ES and 150 mana, for 600 total, and the mana regeneration is very noticeable. Once you have a little currency, a high ES rare chest becomes a strong option. The damage taken from Mana Before Life desecration suffix on chests can roll up to 20%, and feathered raiments in particular give another 10% on the implicit. You can then use suffixes for resistances, intelligence, or mana regen. At higher budget, Atziri's Splendor is fantastic, especially with high ES and the modifier that treats socketed soul pores is also socketed in helmet slots. That lets us stack another 18% increased maximum mana on top of the huge amount of mana it already gives through Eldritch Battery. Crim let me has the test, and it gives my build around 3000 mana, which is absurd. A better rolled one could give around 600 more max mana on top, but at that point we're well into multi-mirror territory. But I still wanted to point out that extra 600 mana would still give about 15 to 20% more damage on this build. That's how nuts the mana scaling gets. The downside with Atziri's Splendor is that you lose the Willpower rune slot and you lose access to the damage taken from Mana Before Life's desecration suffix. So you need to pick up damage taken from Mana Before Life elsewhere, mostly on the tree. Thankfully there are efficient ways to do this with some creative unique dual choices, and the trade-off is more than worth it. The other endgame option is Temporalis. This changes the build quite a bit, turning it into an incredibly fun speed farmer with instant screen clear and almost no blink cooldown. It also lets you drop most or all CDR investment and scale other damage multipliers instead, like crit damage and shock magnitude, to make up for the lower ES and lower max mana. If you're running Temporalis, Arc is a good substitute for Frost Darts in the bossing setup because it avoids multiple Mana Flare procs. For your other rare armor pieces, you mostly want high ES bases with good increased ES rolls or maximum mana rolls on prefixes. For suffixes, resistances and intelligence are very strong. At high budget, you can craft items with 60% increased effective socketed items. With 3 augment sockets, that lets you stack a huge amount of flat mana through mana roots. For the helmet, we actually do not want flat mana as the priority. We instead want to stack energy shield as high as possible. This is because of Dracani's Thesis, which gives us maximum mana based on the item energy shield on our equipped helmet. For suffixes, resistances, crit chance and intelligence are all very useful. A helmet with 2 or 3 augment slots is ideal, so we can slot multiple maximum mana soul cores and scale max mana even harder. For the belt, the big chase item is a Darkness Enthroned with 100% or greater increased effective socketed items. That breakpoint is very important. It lets a mana soul core give 6% maximum mana instead of 5, but more importantly, it scales Dracani's Thesis so we get 2 maximum mana per 2 helmet energy shield instead of 1. On lower budget, 2 5% max mana soul cores are still perfectly fine. At entry level, a rare belt with good resistances and high max mana also works. Midnight Braid could be another early option, giving a huge amount of mana recoup and some nice reactive sustain against incoming damage. But eventually, the proper Darkness Enthroned plus Dracani's setup is a huge priority. My current belt is giving me around 1.2k max mana, and there is really no beating that for scaling the endgame. For rings, you ideally want Breach Rings taken to 40% quality with Neural Catalysts. You want to aim for T1 mana, percent max mana from Perfect Essence of the Mind, and high tier mana regeneration. If you can also fit a good life prefix here to round out your prefixes, then that's even better. For suffixes, you mostly use rings to fix elemental and chaos resistances. This slot can get expensive if you buy finished rings outright, but crafting on a decent base with T1 mana is usually much cheaper. The amulet is probably the clearest example of why this build is so cheap to gear compared to a conventional mana stacker. Normally, this slot gets incredibly expensive because you want mana, spirit, and spell levels all at once, but we only care about the first. For prefixes, you want high tiers of percent max mana, and flat ES. For suffixes, you have loads of good options. All attributes, intelligence, resistances, crit damage, crit chance, or mana regeneration rate, just to name a few. Then you want a Kurgle Suffix Desecration to aim for damage taken from mana before life. This mod is also mana tagged, so Neural Catalyst scale it alongside the mana prefixes. My current amulet, even at the end of this league with a hyper-inflated economy, cost me under 20 divines to make, which is almost nothing, and gives almost 1.2k mana after all modifiers, plus 19% damage taken from mana before life. For this build, that's an absurd amount of power from a piece that would look useless to most casters because it has no spell levels. For Anoints, Gem Enthusiast is very hard to beat. 5% increased max life, 5% increased max mana, and 5% movement speed. There are better pure damage options, but the utility here is unmatched. Even Cooked, the best passive tree for the build's DPS in the entire tree, which gives 60% increased crit damage bonus, is only slightly stronger for damage than the 5% max mana. Again, we're a real mana stacker build here, just like from the PoE1 days. For a mana flask, Leviandra's Spirit is a small but welcome boost to mana recovery in lieu of better options in this slot. For the life flask, you want an ultimate life flask with as close to the max roll and increased number of charges as possible to scale your bleed damage on bosses via Concoct 2. For charms, we have a lot of freedom. Like I said before, freeze immunity is the main one I would prioritise because freeze is probably the most annoying and dangerous element the build faces. Shock immunity is also nice, especially if we're using overcharge. If your life pool is low, a stun immunity charm is a good early option, but once you have Crimson Power and a high ES chest, this shouldn't be necessary at all. At high budget, any rite of passage charm can be useful, but a few spirits stand out in particular. Spirit of the Bear is a huge defensive package, giving max life, stun threshold, and 20% reduced damage taken. Cat and Stag variants are nice for movement speed, while Boar's guaranteed bleed can help mapping damage where we otherwise only have a 15% bleed chance by default. The passive tree will be included in the attached path of building link, which is the best way to interrogate it properly, but we'll go over the broad themes. Because our mapping and bossing requirements are quite different, we make full use of both passive trees. First, any nodes giving percent max mana or high intelligence are obviously very valuable. We also need Eldritch Battery to convert our ES to mana, but it's close to the Witch start, and it's the only keystone we take directly in the tree, which gives us a fair bit of flexibility in how we path. With how frequently we hit and crit while mapping, Touch of the Arcane is very reliable, giving us a boosted Arcane Surge buff that is basically permanently up in maps due to the 10% chance to proc for 4 seconds on crit. Crit is obviously very important for the build, so efficient crit clusters are mandatory and great DPS gains. Dual sockets are also very powerful, particularly for bossing. A good rare Sapphire can give up to 40% crit damage bonus and 35% bleed magnitude, which works out to be something like 15% more damage per slot where I'm at on the character. On a more optimised version, I'd probably repass significantly to pick up more of these dual slots. A rare Adorn setup would also be extremely powerful, although obviously tremendously expensive. Controlled Metamorphosis in the top left corner is very strong. It lets us pick up Calibration for 4% max mana, All Natural for some all res and Ellie damage, Adverse Growth for 20% mana recoup plus 8% damage taken from Mana for Life on its small nodes, and Erraticism for 16% cast speed to smooth out clear. Then, a Kurgle Undying Hate gives Sacrifice of Mind, letting our mana regen overflow. We do have to pay the 50% less mana regen penalty, but the build has enough sustain to maintain overflow very comfortably, even while bossing, where we're purely relying on mana regen. This is great to position up at Chaos Inoculation, where it won't overwrite any useful nodes. You have some options for From Nothing, and it can be skipped entirely if you want. I'm going for a Crimson Assault one, letting me throw 3 points on the mapping tree into 22% CDR and 15% skill effect duration to smooth out clear, and 45% bleed magnitude on the bossing tree for more boss damage. Skipping this and using a rare jewel instead is also completely reasonable and higher damage. Now for what each tree does separately. For mapping, the primary tree picks up all the increased area of effect for spells available to us of Royal and Reverberation. We also pick up the Temporal Mastery Cluster for another 21% cooldown recovery, then help mapping sustain with 4% mana on kill from efficient killing, and 3% mana on remnant pickup for Arcane Remnants. The mapping setup uses pinpoint critical to cap crit, so we need very little crit chance investment there. For bossing, we collect enough crit chance to hit 100% without pinpoint critical to make full use of our crit damage bonus, then pick up more crit damage bonus on the tree where available. We also go into Shredding Force and Blood Tearing, which give a lot of ailment magnitude and some crit damage bonus, making them very efficient for our bleed setup. This tree probably has tons of rooms for improvement, so if you see anything really cool I've missed, I'd love to know in the comments. So yeah, that's the build. Mana Flare Blood Mage, the no spell level caster. With the next leak coming soon, I definitely wouldn't treat this video, or indeed any other video out there, as some guaranteed future-proof build guide, right? A lot can and probably will change going into the next patch. I learned that the hard way with Entangle. This build isn't the strongest or fastest character in PoE2 by any means, but for what started out as a fringe experiment to see how far you could take a build like this, I think I wound up with something really solid and fun. So much in fact that if it doesn't get nuked from orbit by any changes, I plan to switch to it next league as soon as possible and see how far I can take it. And if the build survives patch 0.5, I'll look into doing a proper written guide and update, and maybe look at how you might level into it. For now, POB links are in the description. So yeah, thanks for checking out my content, and I really hope we'll see you in the next league. Have a good day.